I claimed I was a victim, but I've been secretly sneaking out to meet my ex on a secret island in the Mediterranean, and I can hear how that sentence lands even as I say it to you, heavy and messy and a little ridiculous. But you clicked for a reason, and since we're apparently doing truth tonight, I'll give you all of it. I'm Rhea 30, a marine cartographer for a conservation nonprofit. The kind of person who stares at seafloor contours until the coffee goes cold and then argues with bureaucrats about why currents don't care about their paperwork. And I wish I could tell you this started with something noble, but it started with a message that read, "Do you still have the map with the old wreck pin?" followed by a coordinate that made my stomach recognize a coastline my head had promised to forget. I was in our apartment in Lisbon, a neat rectangle with pale walls and a balcony that collects sun and stray pigeons. My husband Daniel was in the bedroom trying to untangle a charger knot he'd created by refusing to throw away cables from 2012, and I was in the kitchen pretending to enjoy a tea I keep around because it photographs well. Daniel is a product manager who believes everything can be reimagined if you hold a whiteboard marker and conviction in the same hand. He says I'm the only person he knows who finds romance in contour lines. I say he makes me laugh when I'm being too precise. We love each other in a way that would look stable in a spreadsheet. The coordinate belonged to an island that doesn't appear on casual charts. It's there if you zoom in on the right layer, a smudge with a reef that looks lazy until it breaks your hull, private since the 70s, owned by a family who treats taxes as a riddle you solve with lawyers. 4 years ago, my ex, Leo, was hired by that family to design a microgrid and a desalination system for their pet Eden. He was an engineer with hands that could persuade stubborn machines and a mind that ran on problems the way wind runs through pines. We dated when I was still finishing my master's, when we thought love could learn our schedules, and then we did the slow breakup that looks civil from far away. He went to the island. I took a job that would put me on boats more than at dinner. We said we'd stay friends. We stayed the kind of almost friends that you check on at odd hours. Do you still have the map? After 2 years of nothing more than birthday texts and the occasional "the sea is blue" photo, he sent that. I wrote back, "Why?" He answered, "Because this place is inventing new ways to be itself." Then he called, which he never did without warning. I watched my phone tremble across the counter while Daniel hummed in the next room. Leo's face filled the screen, a little older, eyes the exact color the Aegean turns at 4 in the afternoon. "We think a ship moved," he said, as if that were a normal sentence. Or we were wrong and it was never exactly where the old chart said. I need someone who knows how to listen to the bottom when it lies. I told him I'd forward his request through the office so it wouldn't get me fired. He said, "I'd prefer it didn't get you fired," then added almost shy, "I'd prefer it were you." There are 2 kinds of decisions, the ones you make with your mind like a meeting and the ones you make with your body before the minutes are written. By sunset, I had arranged a field assessment on a nearby island for a government partner, real enough to put in a calendar yet flexible enough to slide me farther east. I told Daniel I'd be gone 3 days, maybe 4. He wrapped his arms around me and said, "Send me pictures of whichever turtle yells at you first," and I boomeranged between guilt and a thrilling, terrible thing that felt like life. The island sits 2 hours by small plane from Athens and 2 more by a boat that pretends it's slower than it is, so you have time to get used to the idea of arriving somewhere you'll have to explain to yourself. From the water, you see low hills studded with brush, a fringe of pines, a slender beach like a pale eyelid. The harbor looks hand-drawn. Seagulls rehearse their complaints. The villa is tucked back, rectangular and expensive without shouting. I swear the air holds rosemary in its pocket. Leo met me at the small concrete pier, barefoot, carrying a coil of rope and an expression I recognized from the first day we met at a conference in Dubrovnik when he'd told me my poster was beautiful and I'd said, "Don't flirt with my ISO lines." We didn't touch at first. He nodded, I nodded, a formal choreography for 2 people who had once fallen asleep in a rental car on a ferry deck because we'd misread the timetable and had to make an island by morning. He pointed to the small RIB bobbing to our left. "I warmed her up," he said, because he names boats like pets. We crossed to the boat and the outboard grumbled into the kind of purr that makes you remember summer and bad decisions and the way salt degrees your skin. The secret part of the island isn't a Bond villain lair. It's not even particularly dramatic. The owners keep it off Instagram by hiring polite staff and asking you at dinner not to tag your location. Wealth is quieter when it knows you're taking notes. Leo lives in a stone cottage near the maintenance shed with blue shutters he painted himself because he wanted one thing he could point to and say, mine. Inside, there's a shelf of manuals and a coffee maker that could do algebra. On the wall, a pinned map I made years ago, annotated in his handwriting, small and neat. We went out that first afternoon to the coordinate he'd sent. There are old wrecks all over the Mediterranean, slumped into the seafloor like stories that forgot their punchlines. This one belonged to the island's family mythology. A supply ship in the 1930s, storm night, hull torn, no lives lost, but the cargo turned to rumor. Chests of something, bolts of something else, arguments passed down at tables whenever the wine became brave. The last formal charting happened in the 80s by a team that ran out of funding. The family loved telling guests that a treasure dozed offshore. They also loved never verifying it. Leo said the seabed had shifted after a winter of angry water, the reef snarling in ways it hadn't before. We dropped a side-scan sonar towfish and read the grayscale story of the bottom. At 10 meters, sand ripples; at 15, scattered stones; at 20, a shape that could be a hull or a trick. He looked at me the way people look at maps when they want the future to be legible. Tomorrow, I said. Dive at slack tide. I want to see the way the sand is curling near that break there. He nodded. We went back in as the light softened and the island cooked supper. There's always a spread here that makes you forget how much food costs when it's flown in. He poured wine. We talked around us. He asked about my work, and I told him about a project mapping plastic accumulation zones where currents gossip and drop their burdens. He asked about Daniel. I gave him the kind summary people give exes, the one that could be printed on a tea towel without scandal. He didn't ask the questions that would have broken the room. The dive felt like a dare between me and the past. The water took us in, cool and conversational. We descended along a line that behaved, my fingers counting numbers the way you do when you're making prayer out of math. The wreck emerged the way faces do in dreams, there and not, more suggestion than statute. Then it clarified. A timbered shape, ribs exposed, caught in sand that had hushed part of it and left the rest to gesture. We didn't touch anything, we're not plunderers, we're listeners. I noted angles, measured distances, photographed the kind of detail only a person who loves drudgery cares about, the hinge of a hatch, a cluster of barnacles that told me how long this section had been sleeping in this particular light. We surfaced grinning in the way that makes other people trust your competence. The hull had shifted indeed. Winter had hauled it a few meters, exposing a section with a cache of glazed amphorae, necks peeking like shy birds. Nothing gold to dazzle an owner's cocktail story, but beautiful in the way truth is when it arrives wearing its oldest clothes. Back on the boat, wind dried our faces and Leo looked at me like we had done something together that counted. And that's when I felt it, the old elasticity that snapped back into a shared language, an intimacy built on recognizing the same pattern in different noise. I'd love to say I went back to Lisbon then. That I wrote a report, sent it off, and slept with my phone in another room. Instead, the island became a rhythm. A government workshop in Malta that ended 2 days early. A survey in Crete that somehow routed me through Athens. An invitation to present at a conference in Palermo with a panel that mysteriously cancelled, leaving me with hours and a ferry timetable. Every time I texted Daniel with photos of water and laptops, I texted my mother with pictures of fish as proof of vitamin D. I told myself it was temporary. Every time I took the small boat from the mainland and watched the island appear with the kind of calm that feels designed. If you're wondering, yes. We crossed that last line on a night when the wind came down from the hills all at once and the generator cut and the stars crowded the roof. We hadn't planned it, or at least we didn't think we had. We'd spent the day pulling data from current meters that sulked at being ignored and fixing a filter that didn't want to be fixed. I'd yelled at a spreadsheet, he'd yelled at a gasket. At dinner, we sat too close because there weren't enough chairs, and later, holding flashlights like kids, we walked down to the water. He said my name the way it sounded when we were young and stupid in Dubrovnik. I put my hand on his chest to measure his breathing like I was gauging swell. We kissed in the way people do when they're relieved at being understood and terrified at being seen. You can judge me now if you need to, I'm not going to fight you. This is where I tell you I had already been telling a story about myself, one where I was a woman politely trapped. I had let my friends believe Daniel was being rigid about my travel, that his calendar sensibility was hemming me in, that I was this soft anthropological exhibit of a modern wife negotiating freedom. I curated that narrative because it made my secret seem like resistance rather than betrayal. I said he doesn't get it and watched sympathy collect in small balls around me. The truth was more boring and therefore more damning. He got it fine, he just wasn't Leo, and I wanted the kind of work-love tangle that only exists when two people choose the same obsession and then weaponize it to make excuses. I wasn't a victim. I was an architect of my own mess. On the island, life developed systems. Mornings at the kitchen table on his back porch with notebooks and coffee that tasted faintly of salt. Afternoons in the water or the workshop. I learned the schedule of the chef and the dockhand and the woman who runs the laundry with an efficiency that would put armies to shame. I timed my arrivals for when the island was quiet, when the family was elsewhere, when the guest rooms were shuttered and the shutters complained in the wind. I knew which of the two ferries changed skippers on Wednesdays and how often the Coast Guard came around pretending not to ogle. I made myself small and precise. I told myself I was simply moving through space with care. And because reality respects no romance, things got messy in a way that had nothing to do with us. A storm on the mainland knocked out power and doubled the price of diesel for a week. The supply boat was late. A politician in Athens announced a crackdown on private enclaves that do not sufficiently contribute to the common good, which meant inspectors with clipboards started showing up in ill-fitting life vests. The family called Leo and told him to make everything look more official on short notice. He asked me to help draft a conservation plan the island could wave at anyone with a pen. We designed turtle nesting surveys, fish counts, an educational program for local schools. We wrote it in a night like students cramming, except we were cramming for the moral right to exist. We laughed at 2 in the morning when my laptop insisted the word herbarium was a fantasy. Then the deserter arrived. He was a loggerhead turtle that had been tagged in Tunisia, new transmitter and all, wandering off the expected migratory corridor as if following a rumor. He holed out on our beach at dawn, ancient and obvious, and dug with such dedication that I wanted to apologize for every human thing. We drew lines in the sand to keep anyone from stumbling over his nest. We radioed the local biologist who supports the region's carapace drama. She arrived with a clipboard and a pragmatism I envied. We measured, we logged, we placed a protective screen. The island woke up around us and clapped in that restrained way rich people clap for nature. It should have been a jewel in our new conservation hat. It turned into a siren. The turtle's transmitter pinged a curious pattern and a small swarm of journalists ended up in the general area sniffing for a story. One of them had heard whispers about the island and came around with a rented dinghy and a smile. He wanted access, the family wanted privacy, the law wanted consistency. For 2 days, everything held. On the third, someone with a drone tried to film the villa's terrace. The owners threatened lawsuits and bad weather. I stood on the beach beside the nest, hands on hips, and thought about how secrets beget secrets until you're standing on clutch after clutch of fragile shells. The confrontation arrived at noon. The inspector, a woman with a braid down her back, walked the path to the beach with the local police officer who knows everyone's uncle. They asked for the manager. Leo stood beside me, barefoot, hair protest. The inspector nodded to the turtle signs. "Good," she said. Then her eyes tracked to me. "We have your name from the ferry log," she said. "You've been here 4 times in 6 weeks." She wasn't accusing, she was inventorying. Still, the ground tipped. I said, "I've been advising on coastal mapping," which was true. She said, "Is your nonprofit aware?" which would have been easier to answer if I were a better person. My mouth, trained by years of diplomacy, found a sentence that involved the future tense and the word report. She looked at me long enough to weigh my soul. Then she accepted a glass of water from the dockhand and told us to send her the new conservation plan by Monday. That night, Leo and I sat on the low wall behind his cottage and watched the dark twinkle with insects and money. I said, "I can't keep doing this the way we've been doing it." He said, "I'll make tea." We were both stalling. He came back with mugs and an expression I'd never seen on him, The one where love is not just a feeling but a will to rearrange your life around what you claim is true. You don't have to explain, he said. But if you want me anyway, I want the version of you that sends the email and then lives with what comes. The next morning, I wrote to my boss. I wrote to Daniel. I wrote to my mother. 3 emails, 3 flavors of confession. To my boss, I explained the island and the potential, if regulated, value of a micro-protected area linked to local communities. I offered to step back if my involvement compromised our mission. To my mother, I said, I have made a knot and I am going to untie it slowly instead of pretending it's a necklace. To Daniel, I didn't use any metaphors. I told him about Leo, the island, the fairy logs that read my name without judgment, the turtle nest, the way I had practiced being a person in 2 places and failed at both. He didn't reply for a day. When he did, he said, "Thank you for telling me before someone else did. I thought we were happy, which I guess we were, just not the same kind." There was crying. There were boxes. There was the domestic autopsy you do when something ends, the tally of forks and faults and what may have grown if you'd pruned differently. He wasn't cruel. I wasn't noble. We were 2 decent people not suited in the ways that make forever, and I had taken the lazy exit, the door behind the bookcase. If you're looking for permission to hate me, you'll find better villains. If you're looking for a mirror, maybe it's here. Work handled it with the weary wisdom of an organization used to the intertidal, that place where lines blur. My boss called and said, if the island becomes real policy, we want a seat at the table. If it morphs into something that makes us a prop, we walk. I promised I could tell the difference. She said, promise me you'll tell the truth faster. Which is how I ended up with a dual life that wasn't secret. I filed official notes after each visit. I mapped the reef with care and published a tiny paper in a journal no one reads unless they love sand. The inspection turned into a partnership with conditions that made the owners grumble and comply in equal measure. The turtle hatched at night during a storm and we stood with red lights and watched the small dark commas make their way to a sea that didn't clap or ask for photos. I moved into a smaller apartment in Lisbon with a kitchen that forgave me for boiling pasta at 10. I learned the hours when grief lets you reply to texts. And Leo. We built something real on that not quite legal island. Not a fairy tale and not a scandal, just a life with meal plans and filters to unclog and the kind of laughter you can only have with someone who's seen you curse at algae. He is not a hero, I am not a teachable arc. We are people in a landscape that refuses to be tidy. Some weekends he flies to me. Some weeks I go to him. We have a shared document where we put grocery lists and things we're sorry for. It works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, we say so and fix the piece we can fix without pretending we can fix the sea. If you're still waiting for the part where I prove I'm not the villain of my own story, I can't help you. I am the person who wrote an email that changed her marriage. I am the person who told her friend she was hemmed in and then used that story as camouflage. I am also the person who stood on a beach with strangers and kept a nest safe until the world took it back. I make maps, and maps are at their worst when they pretend to be the territory. I don't want to pretend anymore. Sometimes, when the wind is gentle and the ferry brings nothing but melons and gossip, I take the small boat around the cape and drift over the wreck. The amphorae sit there, younger now that they are out of the sand, glazed and stubborn, holding a silence that feels full rather than empty. Fish scribble themselves through sun. The reef hums with the low promise that everything is moving even when it looks like it's resting. I float and I breathe and I think about how many stories we inherit about being victims, how easy it is to make yourself small enough to fit one, how dangerous and necessary it feels to stand up and admit that the plot twist is that you wrote the plot. Here's the part one don't say aloud often. The island taught me something my coursework never did. Love and conservation share a trait that makes them both hard and worth it. You cannot save a shoreline because you hate erosion. You protect it because you love what the water keeps trying to take. You cannot stay with a person because you fear loneliness. You stay because you love what their presence teaches your days. Both require attention paid without romance to the daily work. Both fail when you outsource them to myth. When I board the ferry now, I text Daniel. Not because I owe him updates, those days are over, but because he became a person I hope as well. He sends me photos of a bike he rebuilt and a coffee shop that roasts its own beans in a machine that looks older than democracy. We are not friends exactly. We are something else that doesn't have a name and doesn't need one. Sometimes he asks me about currents. I ask him about features. We resist the urge to apologize again. The island remains half-whispered, half-filing cabinet. The inspector with the braid comes by and smiles at the turtle signage like it belongs. The local school brings kids on a field day and I show them where the tide turns and how to read the beach with their shoes off. Leo tracks the generators and curses opportunistic gulls. The owners accept the new rules as the price of claiming paradise. We talk about building a small field station that actually invites scientists not just for dinner. We argue about paint colors because relationships that refuse to argue about small things are always preparing to explode about a large thing. And me. I keep making maps. Not the kind with glossy folds and souvenir edges, but the private kind you carry in your head that tells you where you're lying and where the ground will hold. I make them in my kitchen with the tea that still photographs well and the coffee that I now drink without pretending to enjoy it less than I do. I make them on boats with windburned cheeks and a pencil between my teeth. I make them in conversations where I say, here are the parts of me that are recent. Here are the parts that are old. If we meet one day and you ask, is the island real? I'll say yes. If you ask whether sneaking out made my heart beat louder, I'll say yes and not with pride. If you ask whether I regret telling the truth, I'll tell you I sleep better in beds that know what name to write on the pillow. And if you ask what happened to the map with the old rec pin, I'll tell you it hangs now on a wall in a room with blue shutters, updated and annotated, honest about the way a winter storm moved what we thought would always stay.